The woman collapsed on Samuel Northwood's doorstep during the worst storm the San Bernardino Mountains had seen in 20 years. Her dark hair plastered to her face, and her lips already turning blue from the November cold of 1878. Samuel had been checking his traps when he heard the sound, a soft thump against the heavy wooden door that barely registered over the howling wind. He hadn't expected anyone. No one came up this far into the mountains unless they were lost or running from something, and in weather like this, both scenarios meant trouble. When he pulled open the door, she tumbled forward into his arms, unconscious and light as kindling. Her clothes were torn and soaked through, her hands scraped raw, and there was a gash above her left eyebrow that had bled down the side of her face before the cold had slowed it. Samuel was a man of action, not deliberation. At 32, he had lived alone on this mountain for 8 years, ever since the life he'd known in the valley had stopped making sense. He stood 6'4" with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer down from the high peaks, and his dark blonde hair hung past his collar, because there was no one around to care about such things. His arms were thick with muscle from swinging an axe and hauling water, and his hands were calloused from years of working the land. He carried her inside without hesitation, kicking the door shut against the storm's fury. The cabin was small but solid, built with his own hands from pine and stone. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the single room that served as kitchen, living space, and bedroom. He laid her on his bed, the only real furniture he owned besides a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs. Her skin felt like ice beneath his fingers as he checked for a pulse. It was there, thready but steady. Samuel had doctored himself through broken bones and knife wounds and once a bullet that had lodged in his shoulder. He knew enough to keep a person alive if they wanted to live. He stripped her wet clothes with clinical efficiency, keeping his eyes on his work and nothing else, then wrapped her in every blanket and fur he owned. He built up the fire until the cabin was almost too warm and heated water to clean the wound on her forehead. The cut wasn't deep enough to need stitches, which was a mercy since his sewing skills were limited to leather and canvas. She didn't wake that first night. Samuel sat in his chair by the fire, watching her breathe, listening to the storm rage outside. He wondered who she was and what had brought her to his door. The nearest town, San Bernardino, was a full day's ride down the mountain, and there was nothing else between here and there but trees and rocks and the occasional mining camp. Women didn't wander these mountains alone. They especially didn't wander them in November storms wearing city clothes and soft leather shoes that were never meant for this terrain. When dawn finally broke gray and cold through the window, the storm had passed. Samuel went outside to check on his animals and bring in more firewood. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Tucker, was safe in the lean-to stable he'd built against the north side of the cabin. The chickens in their coop were ruffled but alive. Everything was buried under nearly 2 feet of fresh snow, and the world had gone silent in that particular way it does after a storm, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. He was splitting wood when he heard her scream. Samuel dropped the axe and ran, his boots sliding in the snow. He burst through the door to find her sitting up in bed, wild-eyed and gasping, clutching the blankets to her chest. She stared at him like he was a ghost or a monster, and he realized how he must look, this massive stranger in a tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere. He held up his hands and stopped just inside the door. "You're safe," he said, keeping his voice low and calm the way he did with spooked animals. "You collapsed outside yesterday during the storm. I brought you in." She looked down at herself, at the blankets, at the unfamiliar cabin, and he saw understanding dawn in her eyes along with something that might have been embarrassment or fear or both. "My clothes," she said, her voice hoarse. "They were soaked. You would have died from the cold." He gestured to where he'd hung them near the fire. "They were still damp. I didn't look at anything I didn't need to see to keep you alive." For a long moment she just studied him, and he let her look. He knew what she saw. A mountain man who looked more bare than human, rough and uncivilized and potentially dangerous. But she must have seen something else too, something in his eyes or his stance, because the terror slowly drained from her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You nearly did." Samuel moved slowly to the fire, poured water from the kettle into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Drink this. You need to warm up from the inside." She took the cup with shaking hands and sipped carefully. He sat down in his chair, giving her space, giving her time. Now that she was awake and the immediate crisis had passed, he could see her more clearly. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with dark auburn hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and eyes that were somewhere between green and brown. Even pale and exhausted, she was striking in a way that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. "I'm Samuel," he said. "Samuel Northwood. This is my cabin." "Abigail," she replied softly. "Abigail Kane." She hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry for intruding. I was trying to get through the pass before the storm hit, but I got lost. There's no pass up here. The nearest one is 10 miles south." She closed her eyes, and he saw tears squeeze out from beneath her lashes. "I know that now." Samuel wanted to ask what she was running from because he was certain she was running. People didn't get lost in these mountains by accident, not this late in the year when any fool could see winter was coming. But he'd come to these mountains to escape questions himself, so he didn't ask. Instead, he said, "Are you hungry?" Abigail opened her eyes and nodded. Samuel rose and went to his small kitchen area, such as it was. He had venison jerky and hardtack, some dried beans and cornmeal, a few precious potatoes from his small garden, and the eggs his chickens still managed to produce. He made her cornmeal mush with a fried egg on top, simple food but hot and filling. She ate slowly, carefully, like someone who hadn't had a decent meal in days. While she ate, he stepped outside to give her privacy and to think. The snow was deep and the temperature was dropping. Even if she wanted to leave, even if he was willing to let her go, it would be suicide to try to get down the mountain now. The trails would be impassable for at least a week, maybe 2. They were stuck together, this stranger and him, in a cabin barely big enough for one. When he came back inside, she had wrapped one of his blankets around herself like a cloak. "My clothes," she started to say, "won't be dry for hours yet. I can lend you some of mine, but they'll be too big. I don't want to be a burden." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the pride beneath the gratitude, the strength beneath the vulnerability. "You're here," he said simply. "That's not something either of us can change right now. The mountain's snowed in. Could be a week or more before anyone can get up or down safely." The color drained from her face again. "A week, maybe 2, depending on the weather. This is how it is up here in winter." He pulled a shirt and a pair of trousers from the trunk at the foot of his bed. "These will have to do for now." She took them with trembling hands, and he turned his back while she dressed. He heard the rustle of fabric, the soft sound of her breathing. When she said his name, he turned to find her swimming in his clothes, the shirt hanging off her shoulders and the trousers rolled up at the ankles and cinched tight at the waist with rope. She looked ridiculous and fragile, and somehow more real than she had before. "I'll sleep on the floor," Samuel said. "You take the bed." "I can't ask you to do that. This is your home." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." He grabbed the extra furs and blankets he'd piled on the bed and started making a pallet near the fire. The truth was, he'd slept in far worse places during his years in these mountains. The floor of his own cabin was practically luxury. Over the next 3 days, they developed an awkward rhythm. Samuel tended to his animals and brought in firewood and hunted in the early mornings before the snow made it impossible. Abigail tried to help, though she was clearly unfamiliar with the kind of work that went into surviving on a mountain. She burned the first batch of cornbread she tried to make and cut her finger while attempting to help with the firewood. But she didn't complain, and she didn't give up. He found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, noticing the determined set of her jaw, the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating on the 4th day. As they sat by the fire eating a dinner of venison stew, she finally told him her story. "I was supposed to get married," she said quietly, staring into her bowl. "3 weeks ago in San Bernardino. My father arranged it. A merchant from Sacramento, older, established. I'd never met him before the day he arrived to claim me." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Claim you." That's what it felt like. She looked up at him, and her eyes were fierce. "My mother died 2 years ago. My father remarried quickly, and his new wife made it clear there wasn't room for me in their household. So he found someone to take me off his hands. He didn't ask what I wanted. He didn't care, so you ran. The night before the wedding, I took a horse from the stable and just rode. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't marry a man who looked at me like I was property he'd purchased." She set down her bowl. "I know I was foolish. I know I should have thought it through, but I was desperate." Samuel understood desperation. He'd felt it himself once, the kind that made you do things that didn't make sense to anyone but you. "What happened to the horse?" "It threw me yesterday morning when the storm started getting bad. I think it went back down the mountain. I tried to walk, but I got turned around in the snow." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I genuinely thought I was going to die out there. I prayed for a miracle, and then I saw your cabin. You're lucky you found it. There's nothing else up here for miles." "Why do you live up here alone?" she asked suddenly. "You don't seem like someone who'd choose isolation." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. He wasn't used to talking about himself, about the past, but something about Abigail made him want to be honest. "I had a wife once," he said finally. "Sarah. We had a ranch down in the valley near San Bernardino. We were going to raise horses, have children, build a life." He paused, feeling the old pain like a bruise that never quite healed. "She died in childbirth. The baby, too. A son." Abigail's hand flew to her mouth. "Samuel, I'm so sorry. It was 8 years ago. I sold the ranch, packed what I could carry, and came up here. I guess I needed to be somewhere that didn't remind me of everything I'd lost." He looked at her. "I'm not running anymore, though. This is my home now. I chose it." "Do you ever get lonely?" He considered lying, then decided she deserved the truth. "Every day, but lonely is better than the alternative." She nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. They were both refugees in their own way, both hiding from lives that hadn't turned out the way they'd hoped. That night, Samuel lay on his pallet by the fire and listened to Abigail breathing in the bed across the room. He thought about the way she'd looked at him when he told her about Sarah, with such genuine compassion that it had made his throat tight. He thought about the 3 weeks stretching ahead of them, maybe more, trapped in this tiny cabin together. He thought about how dangerous it was to start caring about someone again when caring had already cost him everything once before. But when he finally fell asleep, he slept better than he had in years. The snow kept falling. By the end of the first week, they were buried under 4 feet of white, and Samuel knew they weren't going anywhere for a while. He showed Abigail how to maintain the fire, how to make proper cornbread, how to collect eggs from the chickens without getting pecked. She was a quick learner, and he found himself enjoying the sound of another person moving around the cabin, the little noises of life that he'd forgotten he missed. She asked him questions about the mountains, about surviving winter, about the animals. He taught her to recognize the tracks of deer and elk and mountain lions in the snow. He showed her which trees made the best firewood and how to tell when a storm was coming by the way the wind shifted. She listened with an intensity that surprised him, as if she was memorizing every word. One afternoon, while they were sitting by the fire mending clothes, she said, "Teach me to shoot." Samuel looked up from the shirt he was patching. "Why?" "Because I don't want to be helpless anymore. I want to be able to protect myself, to survive on my own if I need to." She met his eyes. "You won't always be here to save me." Something in those words struck him hard. The idea of her leaving, of going back down the mountain alone, made him feel hollow, but he nodded and stood up. "All right." He took her outside with his rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that had seen him through countless hunts. The cold was brutal, and their breath came out in white clouds. He showed her how to hold the weapon, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. Her first shot went wide, kicking up snow 10 feet from the target he'd set up. But she didn't get discouraged. She adjusted her stance the way he showed her and tried again. By the time the sun started to set, her hands were red with cold and her arms were shaking from the weight of the rifle, but she'd hit the target twice. Samuel found himself grinning at her determination, at the fierce pride in her eyes when the second shot struck true. "You're a natural," he said as they walked back to the cabin. "I had a good teacher." She smiled at him, and something passed between them in that moment, something warm and electric that had nothing to do with the fire waiting inside. That night, Samuel lay awake long after Abigail had fallen asleep. He was in trouble, he realized. This woman who had collapsed on his doorstep was working her way into his heart, filling spaces he'd thought were permanently closed. He told himself 8 years ago that he was done with love, done with the risk of that kind of pain. But Abigail made him remember what it was like to want someone, to care about their thoughts and dreams and fears. The second week brought a brief break in the weather. The sun came out, brilliant and cold, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. Samuel took Abigail on a walk through the forest, showing her the beauty of the mountains in winter. They saw a family of deer picking their way through the drifts, and an eagle soaring overhead against the impossibly blue sky. Abigail's face was flushed with cold and wonder, and Samuel found himself watching her more than the scenery. "It's so beautiful up here," she said, her voice hushed like they were in a church. "I never knew it could be like this. Most people don't. They see the mountains as something to cross or conquer, not somewhere to belong." She turned to him. "Is that what you feel, that you belong here?" "I did," he said honestly. "Until a week ago, I was sure this was where I'd spend the rest of my life." He paused. "Now I'm not so certain." "What changed?" He looked at her, at this brave, stubborn woman who'd stumbled into his life by accident and turned everything upside down. "You changed things," he said simply. Abigail's breath caught, and for a moment they just stood there in the snow looking at each other. Then she stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green-brown eyes. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "I know I should. I know I'm disrupting your life, but I don't want to go back down there." "Then don't," Samuel said, and before he could think better of it, before fear could stop him, he cupped her face in his large, calloused hands and kissed her. She melted into him like she'd been waiting for this, her arms wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair. She tasted like cold air and coffee and something sweet that was uniquely her. Samuel pulled her closer, feeling the slight weight of her against his chest, feeling alive in a way he hadn't since Sarah died. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Abigail was smiling. "I've wanted you to do that for days," she admitted. "I've wanted to do that since you put on my two big clothes and tried to pretend you weren't terrified of me." She laughed, the sound bright and clear in the winter stillness. "I was never terrified of you. Nervous, maybe, but never terrified." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and that night, Abigail didn't sleep in the bed alone. Samuel held her close, marveling at the feel of her body against his, at the trust she showed by letting him hold her. They didn't do more than kiss and whisper in the darkness, but it was enough. It was everything. Over the next few days, their relationship deepened. Samuel told her about his childhood in Missouri, about coming west with his parents in a wagon train, about learning to work the land and raise animals. Abigail told him about her mother, about growing up in San Bernardino, when it was still barely more than a few buildings and a dream, about the books she loved to read, and the life she'd imagined having before her father decided her future for her. "I wanted to be a teacher," she confessed one evening as they prepared dinner together. "I love children. I love learning, but my father said it wasn't respectable for his daughter to work." "You could be a teacher here," Samuel said carefully. "There are mining camps in these mountains, families who'd pay good money for someone to educate their children." She looked at him with such hope in her eyes that it made his chest ache. "Do you mean that? You'd want me to stay, Abigail?" He set down the knife he'd been using to cut vegetables and turned to face her fully. "I haven't wanted anything this much in 8 years, but I need you to be sure. Life up here is hard. Winters are long and lonely. The nearest town is a day's ride away. If you stay, you'd be giving up any chance at the kind of life you probably dreamed about as a girl." "I dreamed about being loved," she said fiercely. "I dreamed about mattering to someone, about building something real with a partner who saw me as an equal. I don't care about fancy dresses or social gatherings. I care about this." She gestured around the cabin at him, at the life they'd built together in these brief weeks. "I care about you." Samuel closed the distance between them and kissed her hard, pouring everything he felt into it. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words feeling rusty and new and absolutely true. "I didn't think I'd ever say that to anyone again, but I love you, Abigail Kane." "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started loving you the moment I woke up and saw you'd saved my life without asking for anything in return." That night, they made love for the first time in the bed that had been Samuel's alone for so long. He was gentle with her, careful of his size and strength, overwhelming her with the depth of his tenderness. Abigail gave herself to him completely, trusting him with her body the way she'd already trusted him with her heart. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the firs, and Samuel felt a peace settle over him that he'd thought was lost forever. "Marry me," he said into the darkness. Abigail propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "What? Marry me? Stay here with me, build a life in these mountains?" "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but when you've already lost everything once, you learn not to waste time when something real comes along." She was crying, he realized, tears slipping down her cheeks in the firelight. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Samuel, I'll marry you." He pulled her back down into his arms, holding her tight, feeling like he'd been given a second chance he didn't deserve but would spend the rest of his life trying to earn. The weather finally broke in late November, just before Thanksgiving. The snow stopped falling and the trails started to clear enough for travel. Samuel knew he needed to take Abigail down to San Bernardino to get married properly, to make sure her father knew she was alive and safe, even if the old man didn't deserve the courtesy. But first, he wanted to give her a choice. "We could leave here," he said one morning as they stood outside watching the sun rise over the mountains. "I have money saved from selling the ranch. We could go back to the valley, buy a house in town, live a normal life. You could have neighbors and friends and all the things I can't give you up here." Abigail turned to him with such fierce love in her eyes that it stole his breath. "Samuel Northwood, I don't want a normal life. I want this life with you in these mountains. Don't you understand? You gave me freedom when everyone else tried to put me in a cage. You taught me to be strong. You loved me for who I am, not who someone else wanted me to be. Why would I ever want to leave that?" He kissed her then, long and deep, and knew that he was the luckiest man alive. They rode down to San Bernardino on a clear December day. Samuel on Tucker and Abigail on a second horse he'd bought from a mining camp. The town had grown since he'd left it 8 years ago, more buildings and people than he remembered. They found Abigail's father at his house on the edge of town, and the reunion was about as warm as Samuel had expected. "You're alive," George Kane said flatly when he opened the door. He looked older than his years, worn down by life or maybe just by his own choices. His eyes were hard as they took in his daughter and the massive mountain man standing protectively beside her. "No thanks to you," Abigail replied coolly. "I came to tell you I'm getting married, but not to the man you sold me to. To Samuel Northwood, the man who saved my life when your greed nearly ended it. You can't marry him. Your promise to Martin. He paid good money. Then give him his money back. I'm not property, Father. I'm your daughter, and you should have cared more about my happiness than your wallet." Samuel watched George Kane's face turn red, saw the anger and maybe the shame warring there. "You're making a mistake," the older man said finally. "Living up in those mountains like savages. You'll regret it." "The only thing I regret," Abigail said quietly, "is not leaving sooner. Goodbye, Father." She turned and walked away, and Samuel followed. They didn't look back. They were married 2 days later by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through town. The ceremony was simple, held in a small church with only a handful of witnesses, mostly strangers. Abigail wore a simple blue dress she'd bought with money Samuel had given her, and Samuel wore the cleanest clothes he owned. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed his bride like she was the most precious thing in the world, because she was. They spent their wedding night in a hotel room in San Bernardino, a luxury after weeks in the cabin. But the next morning, they both were eager to head back up the mountain, back to the life they'd chosen together. Winter set in hard after that. The snow piled up and the temperatures dropped, and for weeks at a time they were completely cut off from the outside world. But Samuel and Abigail didn't mind. They had each other, and that was enough. More than enough. Abigail proved to be a quick study at mountain living. She learned to make bread that didn't burn, to preserve meat and vegetables, to patch clothes and tend to the animals. She took over the chicken coop entirely, declaring that the hens responded better to her gentle touch than to Samuel's impatient handling. She was probably right. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and read aloud from the books Abigail had bought in town, or they played cards, or they simply talked about their dreams for the future. Samuel taught her to play chess on a battered set he'd carved himself, and she turned out to have a strategic mind that gave him a real challenge. Sometimes they made love slowly and tenderly, and sometimes with a passion that left them both breathless. Every day, Samuel fell more deeply in love with his wife. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it brought a riot of wildflowers and baby animals and warm sunshine that made the whole world feel new. Samuel and Abigail planted a garden together, working side by side to turn the rocky soil. They talked about expanding the cabin, maybe adding a second room. They didn't say what the room would be for, but they both knew. In May, Abigail announced she was pregnant. Samuel felt fear and joy crash together in his chest with such force that he couldn't breathe for a moment. The last time someone he loved had been pregnant, it had ended in death and devastation. But when he looked at Abigail's glowing face, at the hope and excitement in her eyes, he forced himself to smile. "That's wonderful," he said, pulling her into his arms. "That's the best news I've ever heard." She must have sensed his fear because she pulled back to look at him. "I'm strong, Samuel. I'm not Sarah. I'm going to be fine, and so is our baby." "I know," he lied, then decided she deserved the truth. "I'm terrified. I can't lose you, Abigail. I can't survive that again." "You won't have to," she said firmly. "I promise you, Samuel. I'm going to be here for a very long time, and so is this baby. We're going to have a whole house full of children and grow old together in these mountains. That's our future." He wanted to believe her. He tried to believe her. But the fear lurked in the back of his mind all through the summer and into the fall. Abigail bloomed with pregnancy. She seemed to grow more beautiful every day, her skin glowing and her hair thick and shiny. She sang while she worked in the garden, and Samuel would stop whatever he was doing just to listen. The local miners heard about the educated woman living on the mountain, and they started bringing their children to the cabin twice a week for lessons. Abigail was in her element, teaching reading and arithmetic and history to a ragged group of youngsters who hung on her every word. Samuel built the second room, then started on a third. The cabin was growing, becoming a real home. He hunted and trapped and laid in supplies for the winter. He built a proper crib from pine wood, sanding it smooth so there wouldn't be any splinters. He tried not to think about the other crib he'd built 8 years ago, the one that had never been used. In late October, when the leaves were turning gold and the air had that sharp bite that promised snow, Abigail went into labor. Samuel had never been so terrified in his life. He'd faced down mountain lions and bears and men with guns, but none of it compared to watching his wife in pain and knowing there was nothing he could do to help her. The nearest doctor was in San Bernardino, a full day's ride away. They were on their own. But Abigail was strong, just like she'd promised. She labored through the night and into the next morning, and Samuel stayed by her side every minute, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement and praying to a God he wasn't sure he still believed in. When their son finally came into the world just after dawn, screaming his lungs out and red-faced and perfect, Samuel wept. He held the tiny, squirming bundle in his massive hands and felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked away for 8 years. "He's beautiful," Abigail said, exhausted but radiant. "What should we name him?" Samuel looked down at his son, at this miracle he'd never thought he'd have. "Benjamin," he said. "Benjamin Northwood. It was my father's name." "Benjamin," Abigail repeated softly. "Hello, Benjamin. Welcome to your mountain." Over the next few weeks, Samuel discovered that fatherhood was both harder and more wonderful than he'd imagined. Benjamin was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he demanded constant attention. Samuel found himself walking the floor at all hours, rocking his son and singing old songs he'd learned from his mother. Abigail recovered quickly from the birth, and together they fell into the rhythm of new parenthood. The miners' children adored Benjamin. They would gather around during lessons to coo at him and ask when he'd be old enough to play with them. Abigail laughed and said it would be a few years yet, but Samuel could see she was already imagining Benjamin growing up surrounded by these mountains and these people. Winter came again, and this time the cabin was full of life. Benjamin learned to smile, then to laugh, a sound so pure and joyful that it made Samuel's heart ache. He watched his wife rock their son by the fire and thought about how close he'd come to never having this, to spending the rest of his life alone on this mountain. "Thank you," he said one night after they'd put Benjamin down to sleep. Abigail looked up from the shirt she was mending. "For what?" "For collapsing on my doorstep. For being brave enough to run away from a life you didn't want. For choosing to stay here with me." He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "For giving me back my life." She leaned down and kissed him softly. "You did the same for me, Samuel. We saved each other." The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Benjamin grew into a sturdy toddler who loved following his father around and trying to help with the chores. Abigail's school grew until she was teaching nearly 20 children from various mining camps and settlements. Samuel built onto the cabin again, adding a proper schoolroom with benches and a blackboard. When Benjamin was 3, Abigail announced she was pregnant again. This time, Samuel didn't feel the crushing fear. He'd learned that life was full of risks, but that love was worth the risk every single time. Their daughter, Emma, was born in the spring of 1882, tiny and fierce and absolutely adored by her older brother. 2 years after that came another son, Michael, who had his mother's auburn hair and his father's easy temperament. The cabin that had once been built for a lonely man now rang with the sounds of children and laughter and life. Samuel had never been happier. He'd wake before dawn and lie in bed listening to his family sleep, his wife curled against his side and his children breathing softly in their beds across the room. He'd think about the twist of fate that had brought Abigail to his door, about the storm that had seemed like a curse, but had turned out to be the greatest blessing of his life. In the summer of 1886, George Kane showed up at their door. Samuel answered the knock to find Abigail's father standing on the porch, hat in hand, looking old and tired and uncertain. 8 years had not been kind to him. His hair had gone completely gray, and there was a stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "I'd like to see my daughter," he said quietly, "if she'll see me." Samuel wanted to turn him away to protect Abigail from this man who'd valued money over his own child's happiness, but it wasn't his choice to make. He called for Abigail, and she came to the door with Emma on her hip and a wary expression on her face. "Father," she said, her voice neutral, "Abigail, you look well. Motherhood suits you." George Kane's voice was rough with emotion. "I came to apologize. I was a fool and a bad father, and I've regretted it every day for the past 8 years. Your stepmother left me 2 years ago, and I've been alone since then. It made me realize what I threw away when I threw you away." Abigail was quiet for a long moment. Emma fussed, and she shifted the little girl to her other hip. "Why now?" she asked. "Why wait so long? Pride, I suppose. Shame. Fear that you wouldn't want to see me, that you'd tell me to go to hell, which would be no more than I deserve." He looked past her into the cabin, at Benjamin playing on the floor with his blocks, at the life she'd built. "But I'm an old man now, and I don't have time for pride anymore. I wanted you to know I was sorry. I wanted to meet my grandchildren if you'll let me." Samuel put his hand on Abigail's shoulder, letting her know the choice was hers. She looked up at him, and he saw the conflict in her eyes, the old hurt warring with the possibility of reconciliation. "You hurt me," she said finally, turning back to her father. "You made me feel worthless. You treated me like something to be sold. I know, and I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway." Abigail took a deep breath, then stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Meet your grandchildren, but understand that you'll have to earn their love and mine. It doesn't come free just because you're blood." George Kane nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I understand. Thank you, Abigail." Over the next few months, George Kane became a regular visitor to the mountain. He was awkward with the children at first, unsure how to talk to them or play with them. But Benjamin, Emma, and Michael had inherited their mother's generous heart, and they gradually warmed to this elderly man who brought them peppermints and carved wooden toys. Samuel watched Abigail slowly open up to her father, saw the relationship between them begin to heal. It wasn't easy, and there were tense moments when old wounds surfaced. But Abigail had learned strength and forgiveness in these mountains, and she extended both to her father. One evening in late fall, after George had gone back down the mountain and the children were asleep, Abigail sat with Samuel on the porch they'd built a few years ago. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the air smelled like pine and coming snow. "You think I did the right thing?" she asked. "Letting him back into our lives," Samuel pulled her close. "I think you did what your heart told you to do. That's all any of us can do. I keep thinking about how angry I was at him 8 years ago, how I swore I'd never forgive him." She shook her head. "But anger is exhausting. And I've learned that life's too short to waste on grudges. He's trying, Abigail. Anyone can see that. I know. And the children love him, which helps." She looked up at Samuel. "Do you ever regret it, marrying me, taking on all the complications I brought with me?" He laughed and kissed the top of her head. "Not for one single second. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. You and these children, this life we've built. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the part where I collapsed on your doorstep half dead, especially that part. Though maybe next time you could just knock like a normal person." She laughed and swatted his arm, and he caught her hand and kissed it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the mountain. The years continued to roll by. Benjamin grew tall and strong like his father, Michael became the family peacemaker, and Emma developed a stubborn streak a mile wide. Abigail's school flourished, and she became known throughout the region as the best teacher in the San Bernardino Mountains. Samuel's reputation as an honest man and a skilled hunter brought him steady work and respect from the miners and settlers. George Kane died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1890, and they buried him in the small cemetery in San Bernardino. Abigail cried at the funeral, but they were healing tears, grief mixed with gratitude that she'd had those last few years with her father. By 1895, Benjamin was 17 and talking about heading to Sacramento to study engineering. Emma, at 13, announced she wanted to be a doctor, which shocked everyone until they realized it shouldn't have. She'd inherited her parents' determination and her grandfather's stubbornness. Michael, at 11, was content on the mountain and showed signs of following in Samuel's footsteps. Samuel was 50 by then, his hair more gray than blonde, his body still strong but showing the wear of years of hard work. Abigail, at 39, was as beautiful to him as she'd been the day she collapsed on his doorstep. More beautiful, really, because now he knew every line on her face, every scar and story that had shaped her one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Abigail said, "Do you remember what you said to me that first week, about being lonely?" "I remember." "Are you still lonely?" Samuel looked at her, at this woman who'd given him everything, who'd filled his life with love and laughter and purpose. "Not for one single day since you came into my life," he said. "You made me whole again, Abigail. You and our children, you're everything I never knew I still needed." She smiled and leaned against him. "Good, because I'm not planning on leaving anytime soon." "How soon?" 50 years or so, maybe 60 if we're lucky. He laughed and pulled her close. "I'll take whatever time we get." They sat there as the sun went down and the stars came out, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful in the wilderness. The mountains rose around them, ancient and eternal, and inside the cabin, Their children were laughing about something. It was an ordinary evening, really. Nothing special. But it was everything Samuel had ever wanted. Benjamin did go to Sacramento, and he became a successful engineer who designed bridges and buildings. Emma went to medical school in San Francisco, one of the few women in her class, and came back to practice in San Bernardino. Michael stayed on the mountain, eventually building his own cabin a mile from his parents and marrying a sweet girl from one of the mining camps. Samuel and Abigail became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The cabin expanded again and again, becoming almost a small compound. Abigail kept teaching until she was 70, and even then, former students would come by to visit and thank her for changing their lives. On a warm spring day in 1920, Samuel Northwood died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74. He was in his own bed, in the cabin he'd built with his own hands, surrounded by his family. Abigail held his hand as he took his last breath, and she whispered that she loved him, that she'd see him soon. She followed him 6 months later, as if she couldn't bear to be without him for long. Her children found her on the porch, sitting in her favorite chair, looking out at the mountains she'd loved for more than 40 years. She had a smile on her face. They buried Samuel and Abigail side by side on a hill overlooking their cabin, with a view of the mountains stretching away in every direction. The headstones were simple, just their names and dates, but underneath was an inscription that Emma had chosen. Two souls who found each other in the wilderness and never let go. The cabin still stands today, maintained by their descendants who come up the mountain every summer to remember the love story that started it all. They tell the tale to their children and grandchildren about the woman who collapsed on a mountain man's doorstep during a snowstorm, and how he nursed her back to health, and how she never left again. They talk about the love that grew in that tiny cabin, love strong enough to weather every storm, every hardship, every challenge that life threw at them. It's a story about second chances and choosing bravery over fear. It's about finding home not in a place but in a person. It's about the kind of love that comes once in a lifetime if you're lucky, the kind that changes everything. And it all started with a woman collapsing on a doorstep, and a man brave enough to open the door and let love back into his life.